Welcome to the Talking Poem Podcast. I'm your host, Charlie Green. Usually I talk with a guest about the poem of their choice, but on today's short form episode, I'm going to bring you a bit of joy and a preview of coming attractions. I'm going to talk about Russell Edson's short comic poem with Sincerest Regrets, and in a few weeks I'll have an episode about another poem of Edson's. Since he's a later 20th century writer who I think gets overlooked a bit, I'd like to draw more attention to him. He's a great comic poet, and I think comic poetry gets dismissed or is sometimes thought of as lesser, maybe because it seems like it's unpoetic in some way, but comedy done well in poems resonates the way that a lot of comedy just doesn't age well, but when it works in a poem, it really sticks, and for me, that's the case with Edson. So without further ado, with Sincerest Regrets, there is an epigraph for Charles Simic. Like a monstrous snail, a toilet slides into a living room on a track of wet, demanding to be loved. It is impossible, and we tender our sincerest regrets. In the book of the heart, there is no mention made of plumbing. And though we have spent our intimacy many times with you, you belong to an unfortunate reference, which we would rather not embrace. The toilet slides away. I love this poem so much. His poems, Edson's, are always interested in propriety, particularly the ways in which people try to set themselves apart from what is animal in them or what they see as base in them. The toilet is honestly one of the most intimate objects in our lives, where we're sometimes at our most vulnerable, and there's so much taboo about the bathroom and about the body. The poem begins by sounding like a poem with a fantastic simile, like a monstrous snail, the toilet. The visual image of the toilet as a snail, for me, it comes with that snap of surprise that's common to excellent figures of speech and to great jokes. And I love that Edson draws out the simile. Just as a snail leaves its trail, the toilet slides into a living room on a track of wet. The track of wet is obviously defamiliarizing and gross, but it's that demanding to be loved phrase that really kicks off what the poem, I think, is interested in. How emotion and the language of emotion gets sterilized, particularly by corporate environments. All these words of connection and communion are in the poem. Love, tender, sincerest, regrets, the heart, intimacy, belong, embrace, and even plumbing, if you think of plumbing the depths of emotion. But these words, they're all distanced and ironized through the language of this kind of corporate rejection. It is, there is, and then that we. The we, it's distant and aloof, and it's scared of the intimate. And ironically, it's a lonely plural. That corporate language, it's twisting itself to avoid being frank and to being honest. In the book of the heart, there is no mention made of plumbing. There's just something so funny about the way that the language is avoiding saying what that intimacy is and keeping itself at a kind of arm's length. My favorite phrase is an unfortunate reference. You belong to an unfortunate reference, which we would rather not embrace. It's just twisting itself into knots to avoid actually saying what that unfortunate reference is. And the opening line itself is so strange. It's like the corporate voice recoils from that intimacy, from the demand to be loved. And ultimately for me, that strangeness, it captures, I think, the terror of real human intimacy. In co-opting the language of sincerity, that corporate voice, it dulls the language of sincerity and it creates this kind of lonely distance. So when I came across the poem, I shared it with my friend Nick, who also loved it. But he thought the final line was unnecessary. We get the return of that narrative voice. The toilet slides away. I understand completely where he's coming from, and honestly, I go back and forth about it myself. The line prior to that captures the distance of the corporate language so wonderfully. There's an ellipsis after which we would rather not embrace, and that ellipsis kind of lets us slink away from the poem. But I think the justification for the final line is that we get the reminder that the corporate language is embedded in the poem. The opening line is not the language of that corporate voice. The frame closes and reminds us of that. Also, there's this ellipsis after the toilet slides away, and it's hard to look at that ellipsis and not think of the snails and the toilet's trails leading off as the toilet slinks away. I think that matters because even the basest among us needs love. Even in our own ways, as gross as we might be at our lowest and basest, we need and demand that love. We are at bottom, no pun intended, a being that needs that kind of love and that kind of communion. And our language sometimes gets so degraded that we don't know how to express it. That's the kind of humor I love in a poem. It's so strange that it seems impossible to replicate. Just thinking of the mind that sees the resemblance of snail and toilet and decides to run with it on the page, so to speak. And the strangeness lets us in on something compelling and mysterious as loneliness, how we're lonely for each other, and because we have these taboos about our bodies, we're even lonely for ourselves. Today's episode is brought to you by porcelain, which is particularly resonant with Edson's poem. The word for porcelain in English comes from the Old Italian porcellana, which means cowrie shell. The cowrie is a sea snail, so our word for porcelain comes from the shell of a sea snail. The toilet's often made of porcelain, so the connection in Edson's poem is even richer than I thought after the first few times I read it, and maybe even richer than you have thought. From ceramics to plates to toilets, it's porcelain. It's in your kitchen. It's in your bathroom. Porcelain. It's what's for dinner. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great day. Go read some poems, pet some dogs, and support striking workers wherever you find them. Bye.